Hello, everyone, and you're very welcome to today's session for the Digital Business Services T-Level and preparing for the Data Technician Occupational Specialism assignment. And the plan for today's webinar is to begin just with some quick introductions before having a high-level overview of the assessment, and then we will look at each task within the assignment in turn. We're going to begin with an overview of the assessment, including marking and grading information. Now, as I'd imagine most of you are in year 2 of delivery right now, I'm sure you're very familiar with the QualHub page for the Digital Business Services T-Level. But there is one resource on there which could be quite easy to miss. In the Support tab, along with our sample Occupational Specialism assignments, we have got exemplification materials, and these show a pass and distinction example of work for the sample Occupational Specialism assignment. And they also contain comments by the examiners highlighting the positives and areas for development. Another key area that I just want to highlight is the resource requirements section in the specification. And this states the resources you'll need to deliver the core and occupational specialism components. And for the live assessments, a provider guide will be given to you. And this lists the specific resources needed for each task, but should remain relatively similar to the sample version on QualHub. The data technician assignment will assess the 6 performance outcomes from your content delivery. As this is a synoptic assessment, you will need to ensure your delivery is completed before the assessment date. The weighting of each of the performance outcomes to the assignment is shown on screen, with a larger weighting being given to performance outcome 4 regarding interpreting data and communicating results, as that's a highly important aspect when working in a data technician role. Now, if you have previously attended or watched our webinar on planning your year 2 delivery, you'll have seen a 2-year sample plan similar to this. But just focusing in on year 2, and as mentioned previously, you'll need to have completed delivery before students can sit the assessment. And by the end of February or beginning of March might be a good target to ensure sufficient time for revision and practice with your students. Of course, that's dependent on your own delivery model, the number of hours you'll have with your students, any block placements that might be planned, etc. Now, the deadline for registering students onto the assessment is the 6th of April, and it's best to do that soon if you haven't done so already to ensure you don't receive any late fees. And another reason not to wait is because of the assignment pre-release to providers, and that's on the 31st of March. And you won't have access to that pre-release unless your students are registered. And I do need to emphasize here that this pre-release is for providers only. This is not to be given to students. It is for your eyes only for planning and preparation purposes. So students shouldn't be given any information regarding the live assignment until the date of the first task, which is the 24th of April. Now, the reason I'm making such a significant point of highlighting this is actually because of the employer set project, since the employer set project also has pre-release information which can be given to students. And I want to ensure no oversight occurs here, and to ensure that you do not give students any of the live occupational specialism assessment information before that first task on the date, and that's been set by NCFE. Now, as for the assignment itself, the delivery is very similar to the employer set project, where tasks are completed under supervised conditions. Students can only have access to the assessment materials during those supervised sessions, and the evidence will be submitted to NCFE for marking. And students will take on the role of a data technician and complete various tasks. and these have been designed to be as occupationally realistic as possible with input from educators, employers, and industry experts. Now, we will look in depth at each task, but this table just contains a summary of what to generally expect each year. And I say generally, as we do have reviews and take account of provider feedback too. Currently, though, the first task will be on the Monday of the first assessment week, and that will usually be mid to late April. And this is involving research and writing a proposal. Task 2 takes place over 2 days with morning and afternoon sessions and is weighted at 45%, as students need to analyze and blend data sets, which is considered to be essential for a data technician role, which is why that task is worth 45%. The second week is when students will begin the third task, which is spread over 2 days. And is where students will look for correlations in the data and create dashboards. And task 4 is in the third and final week, where students need to make and record a presentation. Now, when looking at this 3-week assessment period, NCFE will be setting the specific dates for students to actually sit the assessment with morning and afternoon sessions. However, we have got gaps between these task sessions, and this is in case there are any students who happen to be absent on the day of the assessment. So these gaps can be utilized for catching up students who may have been absent on the actual day of the task. And do make every effort to ensure tasks are completed before the subsequent task commences. Now, this table shows the intended weighting of each task and a number of marks available. And you can see there is a problem here, as the task weighting and the actual mark weighting aren't the same. Now, it's not always possible or practical to increase the number of marks available for a task. Otherwise, it could become overly prescriptive and the assessment wouldn't be as valid or reliable. So instead, a scaling factor is used. And this is a number that will be multiplied by the raw marks in order to make what's called a scaled mark. Now, these are the scaling factors for the different tasks. And by applying this to the raw marks, we can now have the actual weightings aligned. Looking at task 2, for example, the maximum marks for task 2, raw marks, is 52 marks. But we multiply it by our scaling factor, and this will happen with the student's marks. For task 2, it's 1.846. And now we have our scaled mark, which is 96 marks, essentially available now instead of 52. And that means our weightings have now come into alignment. But let's have a look at this in use when it comes to grade boundaries and your students. Now, the Occupational Specialism Assessment is graded as pass, merit, and distinction. And as the upcoming series will be the first sitting of the assignment, there aren't any past grade boundaries. So the table on this slide is purely an example for illustrative purposes and not based on any data. So the marks for each task are aggregated into a final mark using a linear aggregation mechanism, in which the scaled marks are combined to determine the overall scaled mark needed to achieve the grade. It's probably easier to see this with some example student marks. So this table, we have the results achieved by 3 students in each of the tasks. And for every student, their raw mark is going to be multiplied by the relevant scaling factor to produce their scaled mark. Now, each student will keep their scaled mark for each task to 3 decimal places. And then all of those marks are combined and rounded to the nearest whole number. So if we look at student A, for example, after combining their scaled marks, they have got 174. As opposed to their raw mark of 132. So it's the scaled mark that's compared to the scaled grade boundaries to determine the student's overall grade. And when all the assessment components have been completed, you'll be able to use the grading matrix that's found within the specification. And the overall weighting is a 50-50 split between the core component grade and the occupational specialism assessment grade. So let's say a student got a B in the core component and a merit for the occupational specialism. And the final grade is the intersection, which in this case would make it a merit. Now, students can resit the occupational specialism assignments too, and it is the best grade that counts. Now, and while there isn't a limit on the number of resits students can take, there is a time limit. They have up to 2 years after completing the T level for resits, which would mean a maximum of 2 further attempts available. And the resit would be the entire assignment, so all tasks as well. So it's not possible just to do individual tasks due to the linear nature of the assessment and the interconnectivity of the tasks and the scenario. And the last thing I want to highlight is regarding the results your students achieve. And if you have questions regarding the grades that they get, there are actually options available to you, which are available on a dedicated web page. Now, there are time frames for reporting or submitting various quests following the results release. So it's worth being aware of these options now to ensure you don't miss any of those deadlines. We're now going to look at each task in more detail, beginning with the first one, the written proposal. So task 1 will occur on a date and time set by NCFE with a morning and afternoon session totaling 5 hours. And students will take on a data technician role and be presented with a scenario in which an organization has some objectives they want to achieve, but need data in order to know how to meet those objectives. So the first task for students is to produce a written proposal for the client. And this has been broken down into 3 subtasks. Task 1A is market research and sourcing data that will support the needs of the client. Then students look at the data sets, which could potentially be useful for the client. And finally, students need to consider relevant legislation and practices in terms of data handling and security for the final part of that task. Now, task 1 is the only task that internet access is permitted for, as the students need to perform research. And NCFE will provide data sets relevant for the tasks, and students will need access to suitable software. And if you do use Google or similar online apps or programs, then remember that students don't have internet access for tasks 2, 3, or 4. So it'll need to be available offline for students to use. When students are given the brief, it's important they carefully read it and even highlight the key information given in the scenario. The client and sector will vary each year, but the kind of research students perform won't. So just finding out more information about the sector, finding data related to the sector and the client's objectives, any trends identified that could help the client, etc. So students will put this research into their proposal, and it's important that they include their sources. Now, this subtask is assessing performance outcome 1. I've just tried to put the key aspects from the mark scheme into a summary here. So the evidence should have a wide range of relevant sources, that the information is linked to the client's objectives and needs. For the data the students have sourced, it should include a variety, especially ones that could identify trends. So this can include like historical data and identifying a pattern. And the proposal should also have some relevant and clear tables and charts too. In terms of things you might want to do to help prepare your students, The use of writing frames or templates for practicing how to lay out their proposal can be useful. I'd suggest including an introduction to on these templates, where students can reiterate the key information from the brief and scenario, such as who the client is, what sector they're going to be researching, what the client is wanting to do, what's their aims and objectives. And this could actually help to ensure students are focused on the main purpose of their research, and that the other reason that I'm mentioning this and emphasizing this is because of the employer step project. Because the summer 2022 employer step project, that would probably be the version that the majority of current year two students sat. So if the most people here are delivering year two, it's probably the majority of your students right now. And what the chief examiner found and noted were that students didn't make the information relevant to the brief and to the aims of the client. And as this is a similar task, there's a potential risk that students might repeat this error if not actually prepared. So if you do decide to provide a practice template, then it might be useful to include subheadings too. And there are definitely several different ways that this could be done. But one approach might be to have a short overview of the sector and then subheadings for the different objectives to ensure students remember to directly link the research to the brief. Another tip is to remind students of some useful terms to use when researching, and even have a display, a search term to use for display in the classroom. And even add to this display tips for recognizing credible sources of information. But Wikipedia being inappropriate since it's publicly contributed to. However, just on that point, they could still find the original source of information from the Wikipedia page and use that. So all these little tips and tricks that students can use. And I've added a few useful websites for sourcing data, and it's worth giving students maybe like frequent mini research tasks, or even challenge students to find and use only one data source to make an argument. So they need to consider how valuable and relevant that data is to their argument and to their objective. For task 1B, students will need to look at the NCFE datasets provided and decide which ones might contain data relevant to the client's needs. And there's no deep analysis or processing of the data here, but students should consider the scenario and which metrics would be most useful to look for. Any potential issues as well with the data, such as missing information or errors, and considering relevant legislation and practices when using and analysing the data. Once students have identified those data sets most useful, they need to ensure they provide justifications for those choices. And what examiners will be looking for when marking this evidence is for students to have identified the relevant data from the data sets presented, and for all of the correct data sets to have been identified. So that's two things: the data within the data set, so identifying what data is key, then identifying which data sets. And then we have the proposal and choices that the students make, again, have direct connection to the client's aims and scenario. And finally, the problems faced by the client are well understood by the student. Now, ensuring students make use of the brief and the client's needs, as that is an important factor throughout the assignment, it's worth giving students example objectives and getting them to suggest what to look out for. So if the objective is to increase sales, then some suggestions might be to see what the current sales data is saying. Is there any particular products more popular than others? Are some affected by the time of year, etc.? or maybe the cost of the product or service. How does it compare to other similar organizations offering the same thing? Or the customers, such as age demographics, maybe targeted marketing, online and in person in shop buying habits, or what type of marketing is actually proving more popular: television ads, social media advertising, things like that. And while students are just identifying useful data sets in task 1B, they should have a check of the data too. So giving students any tips or tricks for those sort of quick checks, such as in Excel, F5, and using the go-to special function. And then finally, we have part C, which requires students to explain how the data sets conform to relevant legal, ethical, and professional principles, which is essential part of the data technician role. So this should address the 7 principles of data protection, such as lawfulness, fairness, transparency, purpose limitation, storage limitation, etc. And there may be other applicable aspects depending on the scenario, such as using a competitor's data or infographic, and there possibly being ownership or intellectual property rights issues. And as always with data, security is a factor that needs to be considered, and the management of risks, such as identification, probability, impact, prioritization. Now, this subtask assesses performance outcome 5, and examiners will be awarding students for identifying the regulations and guidelines that's relevant to the data sets and applying them to the data for the scenario and context in the brief, showing both a general and scenario-specific understanding of data handling and security controls, and make recommendations for the data handling and security. As students do need to demonstrate a general understanding of data security and handling, as well as that scenario-specific, you can provide opportunities for students to deepen this general understanding, such as producing presentations or videos, and a video recording actually that might be useful practice for task 4 later on. When it comes to the specifics of the brief, then the best approach is for practicing different examples. But rather than you, the teacher, having to come up with these brief scenario snippets yourself, you could have students actually come up with their own to actually test out on each other. They could even create like sample data sets which aren't compliant with the regulations and standards, and they have to see if their peers can actually spot what is it that's incorrect within there, that's not going to comply. I'm just going to hand over to David Seddon now. He's got some further advice.
Thanks, David. To be honest, I don't think there's that much I can add to what David's already said. I mean, obviously, using projects will probably help the students prepare best. You know, I can recommend if we get students used to working with briefs, going through that brief and can they pick out key information, and then being able to relate to this. You know, for example, if you could use your own college or sixth form, as that's something that's always easier for you to be able to provide information to students as it's needed. And it's also a scenario that will be familiar with them as well. And you can also make use of internal staff, get them to come in, get them to talk to students, let students interview them. And it gets them picking out that key information. And maybe using project management software, you know, you can use like online software like Trello, and it's ideal for students because they can set up groups in it, they can use it to track core findings, they can add links in there to data or legislation or anything else that they find that's helpful. And if you've got guest speakers coming in, or you know, people who work in the college coming in to talk, they can take the notes in there from the guest speakers. And it also gets them working collaboratively as a group. And, you know, those skills that we really need to focus on is understanding the brief. Can they pick out them key requirements? And from this, can the students identify what data they want or what data sets they want and how that helps to meet the requirements. Thanks, David.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David, for that. Task 2 is next, and this task is regarding the blending and cleaning of datasets. This task will also occur in week 1, but this will be over 2 days with 4 sessions required. So AM and PM session on each day, totaling 10 hours. Now, students are free to manage their time as they see fit, and there are 2 parts to this task. In the first part, students need to clean, blend, manipulate, and merge datasets into one single dataset. The second part will require some further manipulation to be performed. And throughout both parts, students will need to log the decisions they have made with justifications. As internet access isn't permitted for this task, do remember that if you use online data apps and tools, then these will need to be accessible offline as well. The Part A will always require students to create a single data set from a selection of datasets provided by NCFE. And the skills associated with cleaning and blending data from different sources has been considered essential for threshold competency by industry experts. And the specific requirements and scenario will change each series, and students will need to consider the client's aims when producing their decision log. And this log will contain the steps or decisions that students decided to make. And students should include justifications for those choices. So this can include the variables that they considered, any errors in the data and how this was addressed, what fields could be used for the different keys, and any calculations and formatting that's been done and why it was done. The second part of this task will ask students to perform some further manipulations and combinations, such as preparing the single data set created for combining with an existing relational database. So that's just from the sample, the way the scenario has presented itself. So the decision log will need to be updated with the actions and decisions made for this part of the task. The specifics to include will be stated on the brief for students, such as the normalization form of the new database, identifying primary, foreign, and alternate keys, explaining what they did to the data, such as any reformatting, removing irrelevant information, and any data validation rules that may have been used. For task 2, the performance outcomes 1, 2, and 3 addresses both parts A and B. The dataset created and the decision logs are checked against the grading descriptors. But like with task 1, I've tried to just give a little summary here. I'm not going to go through each of these points in turn, but performance outcomes 2 and performance outcome 3, they both address parts A and B of this task. But with the descriptors for performance outcome 1, there is only one descriptor in there that's applicable to part A only. And this is how appropriate the data chosen is for the client's needs. Performance outcome 2 also has more marks allocated, which is the student's ability to blend data from multiple sources, identifying the data which is appropriate for blending, use of manipulations, etc., in order to blend the dataset into a clean, unified structure, verified and without any errors. Now, if you haven't done so already, do have a look at the teaching materials on the Qual page, which can be actually adapted for different purposes. So for example, on screen I've shown one of our free resources for at Digital Business Services Performance Outcome 1, which asks students to produce a database to store grades. But this could be adapted for further purposes with some different industries, such as healthcare, and maybe fields like patient name, NHS number, name of GP, height or weight of patient, blood type, etc. Or instead, the activity could be extended out, such as providing an objective for the students to work towards. So keeping the original activity theme of college grades and a database for them, this could be developed just a little step further where the college wants to connect that grading database with their contacts database so they can easily post or text out any exam grades to parents. And it could be taken just again as a step further and have students consider legislation, practices, and security in relation to sharing such information via text and connecting such databases. And I will be repeating this a few times today, but it's so essential that students make that information relevant to the brief and the client's aims. So the more exposure to different scenarios, the better. And I've got David Seddon as well, who's got some extra advice and tips for us.
Thanks, David. Yeah, as I mentioned last time, I mean, using projects such as the one that we've got on screen there is probably one of the best things I can think of. You know, you can easily run this across several weeks. You can break it down into smaller tasks. You can then align those tasks to what's in the OS. And students could then do things like create infographics with the key data on them that they've picked out, and that'll get them used to them presentation and presenting data. They could use statistics from your college, maybe looking at demand for particular courses or particular topics. I know that's changed over the years. Or programs, you know, how programs have changed to meet skills and what's needed for employers. And each time it's digging that bit deeper. You know, for example, if students identified that one of the demands was for software engineers, we could then get them digging that bit deeper. You know, which programming languages would they focus on and why would they focus on that? If we're working with data for a college, then we can easily get students to download data sets and decide which is most relevant. And some of you might have come across it already. I mean, we've got a link on the board there, which takes you through to government data sets for education. And from that, for example, they could look at either FE, HE, they could even look at apprenticeship data. You know, they might decide to find data about careers that are in demand. They could collect data and create a dashboard. And I think David will come to that in the next task. And then that could be presented to the group. You know, make the project big enough so that they're getting the experience of researching, deciding on which is the most important data and what they can put into the findings. And as the students present the findings, it should be evident in how they've approached it. You know, if they're all presenting the same thing, they can see how each group has tackled things in a different way. You could have class discussions following on from this where they look at have they met the goals that they've set out with and different ways that each group's approached it. And you could have groups looking at could they then improve what they've done, either the final dashboard or the research they've done, based on what they've seen from the other groups. So you're kind of pulling it all together with it. I mean, obviously, the purpose is that we're preparing them for the OS assessment, but at the same time, also preparing them for what we do in industry. But by choosing a topic that is something you as a tutor's familiar with, and something that you're confident with, it means that it's easy for you to support the students without too much research. And it's also easier to get externals to come in and talk because we can make use of externals. We can make use of staff within the college, such as marketing department, estates, IT, things like that. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much again, David, for that. On to task 3 now. And this is where students will need to analyze data and produce a dashboard. Task 3 will occur on a Wednesday and Thursday of week 2, which will consist of 2 a.m. and 2 p.m. sessions lasting 2 hours each. And this task is divided into 2 parts, with the first part being the creation of a dashboard to visualize the data according to the requirements of the brief and keep a log justifying the choices made. And the second part is performing statistical tests to identify trends and patterns. Now, in this first part of the task, students will be provided with a clean, single joined dataset, just like that produced in Task 2. And this is to ensure no student is disadvantaged or dependent on their performance in Task 2. Individual clean datasets are provided as well, but students are not being asked to clean, blend, or join the data. But they can use each dataset how they wish to help build the dashboard. So some may decide to use automatic relationships from the base datasets to make a dashboard, as opposed to a single file. And students should automate the dashboards where possible, create pivot tables and pivot charts, and ensure the information shown meets the requirements of the brief. And on the decision log, students will need to justify their choices for the visualizations used, explain the insights that the visualizations contain, and as always, how those visualizations help to meet the client's needs and aims. And in the second part of Task 3, students will be asked to perform a statistical test and evaluation matrix to find a trend or pattern, for example. And as shown on screen is a reminder of the statistical methods mentioned in the specification. Students will also add to their decision log their explanations and justifications for the statistical test chosen, their findings from that test, and with an appropriate evaluation metric reference, such as correlation and Pearson's R. And here's an overview of the mark scheme for Task 3, which assesses performance outcomes 3, 4, and 6. With the decision log covering all 3 of those performance outcomes, the dashboard for performance outcomes 4 and performance outcomes 6, and then we have the statistical test for performance outcome 3 only. Now, again, I'm not going to read through each bullet point on here, but will highlight performance outcome 4 is worth 20 marks. And this is based on the dashboard produced and the accompanying justification on the decision log. And the second bullet point, performance outcome 4 again, comes right back to the relevance of the visualizations to the brief. And even looking at performance outcome 6 and its second bullet point, where students need to explain why those visualizations are appropriate for the client's needs. So again, making sure it's relevant to the brief, to the needs of the client, to the scenario presented. And again, helping students to prepare for this and to save yourself some work, do use and adapt the employer set project data sets as appropriate for students to make dashboards. And again, making those explicit links to the objectives in the brief. And for statistical tests, you could use a quick starter activity where you present students with different scenarios, or better yet, have students come up with their own scenarios that would require a statistical test. And students need to decide which would be most appropriate and why. Give that justification too. I'll hand over to David Ted now for some extra suggestions for our Task 3.
Thanks, David. Yeah, as far as the dashboards and things like that, we've got loads of different tools at our disposal that we can use. For the assessments, there's no requirement that students have to be able to use things like Tableau or Power BI. But they're nice to be able to show students how a data set can look. So some of the links that I've got on the screen there, sorry, are things like the top one, the Data Viz project. They've gathered together different types of data visualization, and it's a fantastic way for students to be able to see what's the best chart or graph to be able to present a particular type of data set. The next three in the Marvel, the Drag Race, they're nice ways of letting students see how a dashboard might work. It's all been created by Tableau and is with students in mind. So it lets you see things that students are familiar with. For example, if they like the Marvel project, it lets them see how all the characters linked together, the powers they've got, and how it pulls through. So it's quite engaging for students with it. And if you wanted to use Power BI, there's a link to 15 examples of projects that have been done with Power BI and ideas for projects. And finally, the bottom link, as students will probably be ending up putting the dashboards together in something like Excel, then the bottom one is just from a video collection of a lady that takes you through putting together a dashboard. And it's probably a nice way for students to do it, maybe as a homework or an activity that way, that they can go through and create a dashboard up outside in their own time, that independent study. Thanks, David.
Cheers, David. That's great. On to our final task now, task 4, which is a recorded presentation of the findings. So task 4 is in the 3rd week and the final week, and this year falling on a Wednesday and Thursday. Now there may be changes to the dates in light of the King's coronation and the resulting bank holidays, so do ensure you're checking the latest version of the key date schedule. But these sessions, they will consist of 3 2-hour sessions. So 2 of those sessions are on the first day, and then 1 more session on the following morning, so on day 2. And the task doesn't have any subdivisions, and students will need to produce and record a presentation that communicates their findings in an appropriate form for the audience. Now, students will use their previously created evidence to produce and record a presentation, which will include their dashboard from task 3. Students will be assessed on their ability to present their key findings and insights rather than on the quality of the information. So this is to ensure that students aren't disadvantaged or dependent on the quality of their dashboard from task 3. Now, an audio recording is required for this, and it's beneficial for students to prepare some form of script to help, because it is an audio recording of this presentation. And this is another task where the use of a template or outline actually might help with practice, such as having an overview of the client and their objectives, information about the sector and trends/forecasts, etc. So having a structure to that presentation they're going to do can be actually built in as well into your lessons. And students should also make recommendations for the client and ensuring it's appropriate for the intended audience. And after the recording is done, do just have a quick look to ensure that the audio did indeed fully record it. So skip through a few frames, ensure the whole presentation is there and recorded as well. And if it isn't, then do have students try and do a re-record there and then, and do contact NCFB as well to make us aware of the situation. The presentation itself will be assessing performance outcomes 4 and performance outcomes 6. And again, one of the key things is the client and making sure the formats used are appropriate, data discussed relevant to their objectives, as does their recommendations to the client. So making sure that those sort of things are appropriate. And as mentioned, the use of a script or notes to aid with the data story would be valuable for students. But even with a script, students might still, trip up over their words during the recording, say something incorrectly, etc. And if this does happen, then reassure students that it is okay. And some tips for dealing with this, firstly and most importantly, is going to be remain calm because mistakes happen and it can actually be fixed. So the examiners are looking for opportunities to give students marks. So we're not looking for what's not been included, but what have they included. So if this does happen with students, they should probably just stop speaking too as well, just for a moment, just to allow themselves to compose themselves to restart. So then we kind of have two scenarios if this does happen. If students have said the wrong information, then they should acknowledge it and correct it. So for example, I want to go back over those figures once more as I was speaking from a different data set earlier, and I want to ensure I'm communicating the information accurately. So even a sentence like that, something like that, and then the students can continue on with their presentation. They've identified it, corrected it, and now they can continue on correctly. But if it wasn't an error that was said, maybe more bumbling of words, I'm guilty of that several times myself, maybe even several times during this recording. But then students should still stop for that moment, then acknowledge this, and just go over that part again. So something like, I'm going to begin that sentence again. I don't think I was communicating clearly enough the first time. So something like that. Oh, I just want to start that section again. Something like that, or start that sentence. Absolutely fine. And as making things relevant to the client and scenario is so very, very important, as I've said so often, such as formats and even language used to present data, students could actually evaluate different data-related publications in relation to who would actually be reading them. So you may have heard of the Westminster Accounts tool that's been made by Sky News and Tortoise Media. And this shows money MPs have received and for what purposes. And it's quite a good tool for students to actually have a play around with, and they can determine maybe what might be happening even in the background, some of the metrics that might be used, and how appropriate it is for the general public. So clear communication is important, very important here too. So the more practice students have at speaking and presenting, the better. And this could be a bit more engaging with using an app like maybe Flipgrid, where activities can be set, but students actually need to reply with a video explanation. So kind of like a TikTok for education. And again, that can help them prepare for that presentation task. Would just like to take this opportunity now from myself and everyone at NCFE to say thank you for taking the time to view this recording. We really hope it has been helpful and helped to prepare you for the data technician occupational specialism. And from everyone here at NCFE, we would like to wish you a very successful and enjoyable year.